Hello and welcome. This is lesson 3 of the slave trade unit. So to get us started, I want you to have a look at the picture on the screen. And I want you to have a real good look at it and think about, first of all, what do you think it's showing? And then secondly, how is this actually connected to the slave trade? Okay, we will revisit this picture a little later on in the lesson. Just have a think. What is this picture showing? How is it connected to the slave trade? So our lesson for today is on the trade triangle and the middle passage. So we're actually going to look at, well, what is the trade triangle and what is this middle passage? So how exactly did we get slaves from Africa over to the West Indies? Okay. And to put your attention towards the key terms, our main key term for this lesson is abolitionist. And an abolitionist is someone who is campaigning for something to stop. So in our case, we are looking at someone who is campaigning to stop the sale of slaves and to stop the slave trade altogether. Okay. So let's start by looking at the trade triangle. So basically, this is the shipping of slaves from West Africa to the Americas, and it becomes known as the trade triangle. Okay? So basically, Europeans would sail to Africa, West Africa, and they would trade goods for slaves. In a lot of cases as well, Europeans would kidnap slaves. Those slaves would then be put onto ships and they would be taken across the Atlantic Ocean towards the West Indies. Now, this part of the trade triangle is what we call the Middle Passage. We're going to go into more detail in a moment about what this Middle Passage was and the conditions during that journey. Now, when the slaves arrived in the West Indies, they would be sold at slave auctions, and then your slave traders would buy sugar, cotton, tobacco, and they would load their empty ships and they would sail with those goods back to Europe. And those goods would be used in factories or would be sold, etc. And the triangle trade would just continue. Okay. So obviously this was an incredibly profitable trade for the Europeans. So there is a video clip that there is a link to for you to watch and to get a little bit more information. But have another little read through this slide. Make sure you do look at our lovely map here. You're going to need to recreate your own type of map to show the trade triangle at the end of the lesson. Oftentimes too, we look at who's responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. So where can we actually place blame? So we've got 9 people here who are involved in some form in the slave trade. So what I would like for you to do is, for this task, I want you to read through those 9 different people and their involvement. And the first thing you need to do is you need to identify, are they largely, partly, or not to blame at all for the slave trade? And I want you to explain a little bit about your decision. So for example, if we look at the bottom corner, the European textile factory worker, she says, my job relies on cotton imported from the plantations. I'm paid badly, but without the cotton, I might not have a job at all. So she is not directly involved in the sell and trade of slaves. However, her job benefits and relies on the goods from the slave trade. So would she be largely, partly, or not to blame? Have a think, write down what you think and why she would be largely, partly, or not to blame at all for this slave trade. So again, for each one, go through and decide to what extent are they to blame. Secondly, could any of these people have stopped the slave trade if they had chosen to? So at any point, could any of these 9 people have chosen to stop the slave trade? Who do you think? And tell me why. And finally, why was it so hard to stop the transatlantic slave trade? So really have a look at how each of these different people rely on the slave trade for their job, for money, for goods. Why, therefore, would it be hard to stop the slave trade? So take a few moments, pause the video, look through the PowerPoint, but I would like for you to have those 3 questions answered on a sheet of paper or in your books, but ultimately we're looking at responsibility and to what extent. This then brings us to the Middle Passage. So this is that second part of the trade triangle. So this is when slaves were being brought from Africa over to the West Indies. So it's estimated that between the 16th and 19th century, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic in that Middle Passage. Now, about 2 million died on this journey, and you'll very plainly see why that is the case. That picture I had you look at for your starter is in the bottom right-hand corner. That is showing a plan for a bottom part of a ship, and those are people. So ships were incredibly overcrowded, okay? Disease was incredibly common because the conditions on board the ship would be awful. You would have rats, you would have people's sick and excrements on the ship. Slaves would be shackled together. They'd be lying down on their backs or on their sides. They would not be able to move very often. And oftentimes, if people had died on board those slave ships, they would just simply be thrown overboard. Now, the slaves were fed, but they were fed very poor quality food. Remember, unfortunately, they were seen as a commodity. They were seen as something to be bought and to be sold. Therefore, it was in the interest of the slave ship owners to have as many slaves alive at the end of the Middle Passage as possible. So you still needed to feed them and hope that as many would survive that journey as possible, okay? There is a very good video clip that I've given you the link to, so have a watch of that as well, and that's really going to give you a much greater understanding of the horrendous conditions and the awful Middle Passage. Thing is, though, how do we know about this? Why do we know so much about what happened? Well, the reason is people actually kept records. Remember, this was seen as a business. So just like other professional businesses, they kept records, very detailed records, of how many slaves they had on board, which ships, how many would have died, etc. Now, the thing is, most average people in Europe didn't know a lot about what the slave trade was like, the Middle Passage, the treatment of slaves, etc., until the late 18th century. This is when we start to see abolitionists. So we talked about that at the beginning, our keyword, people who are looking to ban something. So our abolitionists, people who are looking to ban the slave trade, come out with research and publish their findings. So average people start reading about the Middle Passage, the horrors that our slaves face, and they start to grow angry about it, okay? We will, in a future lesson, look a lot more in detail at our abolitionists, so people like Thomas Clarkson, and the role that they played in abolishing, so getting rid of slavery altogether. So what I would like for you to do is, using page 104 in the textbook, I want you to have a diagram, a drawing for yourself of that trade triangle. So you can literally just draw a triangle if you would like and explain what happens at each of those stages. You can try and draw an outline of the map, or I've actually given you a map that you can use and annotate the map if you have a printer at home, okay? But if not, you can even just simply draw the triangle, what is happening at each stage of our trade triangle. Then I would like for you to read the three sources on page 106 to 107. Using the information from those sources, from this PowerPoint, the video clips, etc., I'd like for you to then write a newspaper article to describe to me the journey of the Middle Passage. To talk to me about the journey for the slaves, what the conditions on board that ship would be like. And you are taking this from the perspective of a person who is witnessing these horrors on board a slave ship. Of course, if you would like to stretch and extend yourself, you do have a hot and super hot challenge question to be working on. As always, if you have any questions, please make sure you are emailing myself or Mr. Marshall. We are happy to answer your questions and to help you work through this. And please make sure that you are having a look on Folder, getting the resources, and having a look at the video clips. They'll be very, very helpful for you. Okay, best of luck.